We come back to the Word of God at the end of our services because we believe that when we gather together, God is speaking, but the place that He speaks most clearly is through His Word. And when He speaks to us in His Word, what He's telling us is He's telling us who Jesus is. He's helping us recognize Jesus, and then as we recognize Jesus when we read the Bible and we listen to the Spirit speaking to us, He welcomes us to follow Him. And that's what we're trying to do even in Deuteronomy. So we've been looking at what Moses says to Israel as they're gathered at this moment. They're getting ready to cross into the promised land. They're going from being nomads to being homeowners. It's a big deal. And you've got this moment where he's speaking, and we're trying to understand that. Moses gives the people the 10 commandments that he's received from the Lord. He's passing that on to them, and he's helping them understand what does it look like to be a community that takes the 10 commandments seriously and then applies it to homeownership in the promised land. It applies it to living together as communities in the promised land across the river. And so he gives us this whole middle section of Deuteronomy, gives us example after example after example where the 10 commandments come to life. And we've been looking at that for the last quite a while. We are on commandment number 10. So commandment 10 in Deuteronomy 5, verse 21 says, "And you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not desire your neighbor's house, his field, or his male servant, his female servant, his ox, his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's." We typically summarize this down to the base statement of, you shall not covet. When you look at the text there, what it's telling us is we're not supposed to be desiring objects or things, belongings, anything that is somebody else's. It's not ours, but it belongs to our neighbor, and we're not supposed to be desiring and fixing our attention on that. And so as a by definition type way of looking at this, we could say that coveting is when we're desiring the objects that belong to other people in our community, right? It's what the text says, but there's another way of looking at the commandment that Paul the Apostle highlights. And he says, when I think about coveting, this is the way I understand that law, understand that prohibition. He says it's when I obsess over objects until it becomes idolatry, until they become idols. And so in Colossians, he's writing to the church and he's trying to encourage them to follow Jesus. And Paul says to them, covetousness is idolatry. Well, that's a big statement. But the idea is kind of like this. So my neighbor has a really, really nice lawn. Much nicer than the way I've maintained mine. I have let the weather dictate the drought levels for my yard, and my neighbor spends a bunch of resources on having somebody come out and manicure his yard, and he's got people who drive out, and he's got a sprinkler system that functions really well, and all the landscaping's been done by certainly professionals. It's bright green, and it looks great. My lawn looks like wheat ready to be harvested. So I can come home and see his yard and long for what he has, right? That's coveting. It's me wanting the thing that he has. When I nurse that and I get bitter about it, I start obsessing over it, I start thinking about it more and more, and I'm angry and frustrated, then what I start associating in my mind is I would be happier, I would have a more full life, I would be more at peace, I would enjoy my home, all this different stuff, if I just had the lawn, the green lawn. It's not really about the green lawn, is it? It must represent something deeper to me than grass. Because who cares about grass? It speaks to this desire that I have to belong to the neighborhood and to be a respected member of the neighborhood. It speaks to this desire I have to be significant. That guy is successful enough in his life that he can afford to have all these people come out and keep his lawn perfect or whatever. And I look at mine and I'm like, I can't afford to do that. It speaks to these internal things that I associate with living a good life, with living a blessed life, with living a meaningful, whole, successful, whatever, ... And so the green lawn becomes a picture in my mind, a little symbol in my mind of the life I want to live and the path to get to that life, and I pretty soon start critiquing God in the portion that he's given me. Saying, God, I'm following you in this way, and I have the gross lawn. I don't know what he's doing, but whatever he's doing is ending with a well-manicured space to live. And I'm willing to make some changes and compromises and exchange in my priorities if it means I set aside you, God, and your way in order to get these feelings of security and belonging or significance that I associate with this idol of the green lawn. And so Paul is able to look at our desire, our inordinate desire for things that we don't have, that we think are going to lead us to the good life, lead us to the blessed life, lead us to the right way of living. He looks at that obsession and he says, it's really idolatry. You're challenging God and saying, following you doesn't lead to anything blessed, anything good, so I'm going to set you aside and I'll run hard after this instead. Instead of going to God for some sort of purpose or meaning or satisfaction, I will go to career placement for that instead. Instead of going to God for provision for my family, I'm going to go and take financial courses, and I'm going to change jobs, and I'm going to start hoarding away resources so that I can afford the tractor and I can afford the lawn care. And we go to these other things for the good life and the purpose and the meaning instead of God. Okay, that's how Paul defines coveting. He talks about it as idolatry. So let's circle back to what Moses says. Moses says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not desire your neighbor's house, field, male servant, female servant, ox, donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's." And here's what I thought. I think this is kind of interesting. He gives us all these different examples, right? But then at the end, he circles the whole thing up and gives us this big summary conclusion statement. He could have skipped it all and just said, "You shall not covet," skip, "anything that is your neighbor's." He would have said the exact same thing, right? It would not have lost any content. But he doesn't. He pauses and gives us examples of things that we might long for that our neighbor has. And if we consider just the first example, "You shall not covet your neighbor's wife," and feel free to insert husband or boyfriend or whatever, right? That partner, that romance or whatever. If you coveting that, what happens if you live that out? You end up if you act on that, you end up cheating on somebody. Somebody gets cheated on. It ends up in a space you could describe as adultery down the road, which is prohibited in the Ten Commandments. Okay, so coveting, born to fruition, ends in breaking a different commandment. Go to the second example. He talks about neighbor's house and field. Okay, how many different cop shows or investigative shows do you watch where the crime scene opens up and somebody's been murdered and the private eye comes in, he says, all right, well, who benefits from this? Who gets the house? Who gets the estate? Who gets the business? Who gets the inheritance, right? Coveting these things turns into crimes even as evil as murder, and we've broken two commandments. Field, male servant, female servant, ox, donkey, those things, doesn't take any imagination to imagine how that turns into theft, right? There's this story in 1 Kings, I think it is, about a guy who owned a vineyard. And it was a nice vineyard, and the king wanted it. He coveted it. He longed for it. He got obsessed over it. He was starting pouting, and his whole life got wrapped around in wanting this vineyard. So his wife comes along and says, well, here's what we do. Let's mess with that guy's reputation. Declare a fast and then tell everybody that he's broken fast, he's cursed God, he's blasphemed God, he's been a terrible person. And then the people will take care of our business for us. And then at the end of the story, through the slander, the king is able to get the vineyard. Coveting bears false witness. So my point is, the coveting exists underneath the surface of all these other commands. Paul connects it to idolatry. We can connect it to these don't hurt your neighbor commands. And it exists almost on this heart level underneath. And I think that that's Moses' point. He's listed all these different things that we're not supposed to do if we're in community with each other and we're living well with each other and if we're following God's way and we're worshiping God and don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. But then he gets to the end one, he says, and don't covet. Don't internally desire something so it turns into an obsession. Don't desire the things that have been given to other people. And how do you legislate that? Could you imagine trying to legislate that in the U.S.? If there was a law that said in the U.S. you're not allowed to covet the things that belong to your neighbor, right? Marketing, anything that has to do with marketing would be illegal. Because marketing is all about building desire that unsettles you and makes you obsessed with this thing that you have to possibly have. And then when your neighbor gets it, it gets under your skin. How would you legislate this? And you can focus on the externals, and that's fine, but what God's saying is to follow me and follow in my covenant way and to be my community. It means that your heart needs to actually be consistent with the external actions that I'm saying, but your heart has to be on point. And how does Moses expect people to live this out? Where does he turn in order to give an example of what this looks like to live this way in the community? I guess that's my question. And to answer it, I want to turn to the book of Ruth. Okay? So Moses did not write the book of Ruth. It came about a little bit after him. But it's this sort of famous Sunday school story, right? Ruth is a Sunday school legend. If you grew up in the church, you know Ruth's general deal. She is not from Israel. She's this lady who marries into an Israelite family. That family, headed up by Elimelech, left Israel during a drought, showed up in the neighboring country of Moab, and gets wives for all of for his 2 sons. Ruth is one of them. And the story turns tragic as Elimelech dies, and then the next son dies, and the next son dies, and you have 3 widows now living in Moab. Ruth does the incredible. She chooses to travel with her mother-in-law, Naomi, away from her people, away from her culture, away from her faith, in order to presumably care for her dying, aging mother-in-law. And Naomi highlights the fact, she's like, this doesn't make any sense, Ruth. Don't do this. This isn't good for you. I have nothing to offer you. I'm just a woman going to die in my hometown. But Ruth is like, no. I'll go where you go. I'll be with you. I'll support you. Your God will be my God. So they travel to Bethlehem. They get there, and immediately Ruth starts getting busy about how can I start providing for and giving to my mother-in-law, Naomi, making sure that she's safe. And so she relies on the generous culture of Bethlehem, which was something God prescribed in these laws about creating margin in the way that you do your business. And she starts using that culture and using that law to provide for her mother-in-law. Enter the scene, Boaz. Now, Boaz is this wealthy guy. He owns the field that Ruth is working on, and he's impressed with her character. She stands out from the crowd, perhaps because she's not from around there, but certainly for her work ethic as well, and he starts asking questions about her. And it turns out that here's the whole story about how she's taking care of Naomi. Naomi is his distant relative. And so Boaz decides to prioritize caring for Ruth. Boaz decides, I need to take care of my family, Naomi, and here's a way for me to do that, to make sure that she gets more than her share, more than her portion, to make sure that she's protected and safe in my field. And Boaz really steps up to take care of his family. Naomi hears about it, and Naomi, the scheming matchmaker that she is like, we can work this to our advantage. And she's like, Ruth, I'd like you to go to him tonight. Which, that's fairly scandalous. I don't know. Naomi's plan is go get in bed with him because he has a responsibility to us as a in-law, as a relative, to take care of us and make sure that our story doesn't end in us just kind of dying as old spinsters, but instead he can come to our family and actually rebuild our family as a distant relative, and maybe he could take you as a wife. And so let's pursue this. And it takes this sort of Jewish romance story turn, and she goes to him at night, and he's inebriated, honestly. And in that moment, chooses to be honorable and says, this is amazing. I am so excited, but I want to marry you the right way. And he sends her home, and then he goes into the court system to make sure that he can legally take care of the family. Ruth's story ends with the spotlight coming off of Ruth and landing on Naomi, if you will, sitting on her front porch, and she's holding a grandson that she never should have had. And the whole town is looking at Naomi and saying, you know what? You describe yourself as very bitter when you got here, but God has made you blessed. He has restored you, and he has cared for you. Ruth was better than having 7 sons. Boaz, amazing. And she holds Obed, who is the grandfather of King David, and ultimately this great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of King Jesus. So that story is filled with lots of good feelings. It's got good vibes. It's fun. It ends on a happy note, but that's not enough reason to put it in the Bible. It's in the Bible because it helps us recognize the way God protected and preserved and brought us to Jesus. He preserved this family as though it was about to die. The family was going to die off, but God protected it and brought us King David and then ultimately King Jesus. And it's in the Bible to help us understand what levirate marriage is. How many of you guys know levirate marriage? Is that a term? My wife said, do not bring that up tomorrow because it's not a term that anybody needs to know or cares about. But I did it anyway. Levirate marriage is what Moses says is the way that we fulfill the law, do not covet. Levirate marriage is where Moses goes when he says, I want to help you understand what I mean by do not covet. And levirate marriage is what Boaz and Ruth engage in order to give a child back to Naomi. So, Deuteronomy 25. In Deuteronomy 25, verse 5, Moses is beginning this conversation about what is coveting and what shouldn't we do, how do we not covet, and instead of coveting, what should we do in its place? And here's what he says. If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her, and the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. All right, Moses, I don't exactly see coveting in this, but let's roll with it. What's happening here is a question about inheritance, basically. Moses is looking at a scenario where there is a young couple, and the husband dies, and the wife is young enough that essentially she hasn't had any kids yet. And the question is, who gets the inheritance? And that's significant because the inheritance is associated with this family's place in God's covenant. If nobody gets an inheritance from this guy, then his family name is cut off from the covenant. They don't get to continue to live in the promised land. Imagine you're Israel as Moses is saying this. The promised land's over there, rivers behind Moses. Moses is talking about you getting cut off from the promised land. That's this big fear. Like, if you could do anything to make sure that whatever home you get on the inside of the promised land, that you get to pass on to your kids and your family and it grows, this is the blessing that God has promised Israel, that these families will get to continue in his land. And so Moses steps in and says, well, what happens when the inheritance is in question? When you might get cut off from the land? Well, he's saying it's the responsibility of the brother to make sure that that doesn't happen as much as he's able. Again, how does this help us with coveting? In the U.S., it's not lost to me, this is weird, right? Like me taking over my sister-in-law's family, that's a bizarre picture, okay? But in the U.S., we do have inheritance laws. We do have this general picture of how inheritance works, right? In the U.S., who gets an inheritance when somebody dies? Go ahead, shout it out. How do you describe that person? Children, next of kin, yes. So typically that would be children or probably spouse. Granted, government gets involved and takes their cut. That's not the point. Children, If there are no children, though, the phrase that we would use is next of kin. And for Israel, it's really not that different. In Numbers chapter 27, there's this question about inheritance that comes up, and Moses goes and talks to the Lord about it. The Lord comes back and says, here's the deal. Next of kin gets inheritance. First, the kids, boys or girls. If there are no children, then it goes to the brother. Fast forward to Deuteronomy 25. The brother here is not given an inheritance, is he? He's given a responsibility. His job is not to receive an inheritance that should be his based off of Levitical law. His job is to preserve his brother's line and his heritage. In other words, what's in his best interest, if he considers like his flourishing in the land, is to take the wife, to take the land, but then not get together with her so that there's no kid. If he does that, then his property increases and his inheritance grows at the expense of the widow and at the expense of his dead brother. You see the coveting thing now? Moses says that is not the way of God. Moses says, in this moment when you have all the power and when your family can grow and it's to your benefit to act this way, instead consider the interests of your dead brother and consider the interests of your widowed sister-in-law, and work with everything you have to give them a place in my covenant and to perpetuate his name at your expense. And he calls you essentially to the principle of putting your neighbor first, putting your brother first, putting your widowed sister first. And this is costly. Setting aside just like the simple picture of like, well, to do that means that he doesn't get the inheritance, it's messy for him to like have to try to get a child for her, and to try to split, like what if he doesn't have any kids yet? What if he doesn't have a son yet, and the only son he ever has is the first son that goes to her? So then what happens to his inheritance? His future's at risk. And so you can start to see how coveting, self-preservation, obsession over the blessing of the land and his home might motivate him not to take care of his sister-in-law and his brother. If he does, though, Moses talks about that, and he says, I'm going to perpetuate. If you don't want to perpetuate your brother's place in the land, I'm going to perpetuate shame over your family. And there's this whole text describing that and how the woman gets to spit in his face, then she gets to rename him and his whole household after this incident of where he doesn't step up and take care of her and take care of his brother. It's pretty severe to act based off of coveting and self-interest rather than to act based off of caring for your brother and caring for your neighbor and caring for your sister, the widow around you. And you get to see that again when you go back to the story of Ruth. Right? If we circle back to that story, right towards the end of it, Boaz is trying to figure out how do I act well here? How do I do the right thing here? Ruth has come to me, but I've got to follow the right steps in the legal process. And so he invites somebody who is closer to the relationship than he is, a closer brother, a closer cousin, or whatever that relationship was. And he tells him, do you want to redeem the land that belongs to Elimelech, but that's going to die off with Naomi? And the guy's like, sure, that sounds good. More land for me. And then he's like, yes, but there is a wife, a widowed wife, young enough who can bear kids, Ruth. Are you still willing to do that? And the guy throws up his hands. He's like, no, hold on. I can't risk my inheritance. I can't risk the messiness of this. I can't risk my place to step up for her. I won't do it. What if more people in Ruth's story acted that way? What if the generosity of Boaz and the generosity of Ruth was replaced with the sort of more self-centeredness of this guy and his sort of covetous thought process about like, if I can get something from Naomi, sure, but if I have to give something, if I have to risk something to care for a widow around me, no way. I mean, Ruth is not going to leave her home country if she's covetous. Ruth is not going to take care of her dying mother-in-law and leave every type of security that she has if she's covetous. And then you get to Bethlehem. The people in Bethlehem are not going to look at this outsider and care for her, provide for her, keep her safe, unless the community has cultivated an attitude of generosity, an attitude of goodwill, an attitude of putting the interests of my neighbor ahead of my own interests. If they don't take seriously God's laws about margins and giving margins to the widow and the fatherless and the stranger, then she's going to have no place to work. And it's going to be a story about the ending of a small refugee family or the exploitation of a small refugee family. It's not going to be the story of restoration to a new community. Or Boaz. Nothing happens with Boaz unless if he's covetous. If he sees the beautiful young Ruth and decides just to take what he wants from her, there's no story. There's no romance. There's no happy ending. If he doesn't decide to risk everything and to put his own future, on the line to take care of his cousin Naomi and to take care of take care of Ruth, then there's no story. And if there's no story, then there's no Obed. And if there's no Obed, then there's no David. And if there's no David, there's no Davidic line. There's no king, no Messiah. Maybe over-exaggeration. I think you can say there's no Jesus. The generosity that these people choose to lean into, following God's way, that gets immortalized and pictured for us and set to us as an example in the story of Ruth, pays dividends beyond what they can imagine. They had no idea that God was going to choose to bring his own son into this family line as a result of their faithfulness to love the people around them and to care for the widow around them. But that's what God did. And so it's really, ultimately the story gets kind of eclipsed. Well, before we go there, I think that the picture that we get at the end of Ruth, I think the picture that we get that Moses is going after as he brings up Levitical or levirate marriage and this type of thing, is that to fulfill the law, don't covet. We need to not be looking at other people's possessions and whether or not, and the obstacles between us and getting other people's possessions or obsessing over them, but we flip it all around and we start looking at our own possessions and asking the question, how can I share and bless the people around me? That's the picture of levirate marriage. That's what Boaz does. That's what Ruth does. And that's like the flip side of coveting. That's the antidote to it. If you feel a little bit obsessed with your neighbor's lawn, start looking at the stuff that God has given you, in thankfulness and in gratitude for that, start asking the question, how can I bless my neighbor? How can I love my neighbor? And that does lead us to Jesus. I love the way Paul wraps this up in Philippians 2. In Philippians 2, we're reading this sort of excited praise of Jesus. And he says, though Jesus was in the form of God, he didn't count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. He's fulfilling the law, is what he's doing, because he has everything that we covet, right? Opening story of the Bible, humanity wants to be equal with God. Jesus has it. Humanity's coveting that place of honor that Jesus has had from the beginning of time, and we're grasping after it, trying to get the thing that we don't have and obsessing over it, thinking, if only, Adam and Eve, if only we could have that knowledge of good and evil, if only God would treat us the way that he treats Jesus, then we would be satisfied. We would be fulfilled. We could live the life we want to live and have purpose and meaning, etc., etc., etc. Well, Jesus has all that. He is equal with God. He has all the comforts of heaven. He's Jesus, the Son of God. He knows the value of it, and he still chooses to empty himself of it. It's the dead opposite of coveting. And he empties himself of this for two reasons, as far as I can tell. One, because it's what the Father asks him to do. And so Jesus does not see his status in heaven as a thing that's vying with his obedience to the Father. Like fighting, God's way is this way, but but I want this status that I have and these blessings of being in heaven and these blessings of eternity. And they're fighting, trying to keep myself secure in heaven. No, Jesus is like, well, if the Father wants me to empty myself of this glory, then I will empty myself of this glory. If the Father wants me to learn humility as a human, then I will learn humility as a human. If the Father sends me to a cross, then I will go to a cross. These blessings of the covenant of the relationship are never at odds with Jesus' desire to simply do the Father's will. That's point one. But point two is the whole purpose of the Father and the purpose that Jesus is excited about is that by giving up these things, he's able to share his place with us. He does exactly what Boaz does. To people who have nothing but a future of death in front of us, and whose family line is not going to go on into eternity with the blessings of the covenant with God, Jesus comes and says, let me be united to you. Please take my place in the Father's family. Be a child of God. Come enjoy an eternity of security with God as his people, as a part of his kingdom. Come belong here with me. I've emptied myself to share life with you. So Jesus is fulfilling the law, you shall not covet. And he's doing this, like Paul does this in the context of an encouragement. It's actually a challenge being leveled to us. It's not just this like isolated praise story, but if we go back to the introduction to this moment of describing Jesus, Paul says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus. Again, Paul is simply saying, don't covet. Instead of coveting, do what Jesus did. Put the interests of others ahead of your own interests. Don't look at your neighbor's blessings. Don't look at your neighbor's possessions and be like, how do I get through the obstacle of my neighbor to have what he has? But instead, do what Jesus does. Jesus looked at his own stuff and says, how can I use this to bless those around me, to love those around me, to give life to the people around me? And Paul says, let that mind exist in you, Christian. There's no place in the kingdom of God for people who live lifestyles of coveting. There's no place for people like me who just get all bent out of shape because my neighbor has beautiful lawn and I just want what he has. And the only reason I'm still in Jesus' covenant is because of Jesus' grace and his goodness and his kindness to exchange my story for his. But with it comes an exhortation and a challenge to live like Jesus and to follow him. Not just, teaching myself to be happy with the things I have and associate all of my happiness with the things that I already have, but to go a step further. And if Jesus looked to his own possessions and asked how he could live, he could give life to those around him, then I need to create some blanks in that statement. And what I need to do is say, Peter looked to his own ... and asked, how can I give life to those around me? And you guys get to insert yourselves in the blanks too. And this is what it looks like to love the law of God, to find it fulfilled in Jesus, which motivates us with freedom to follow Jesus, not just with sort of like the shame of the law hanging over our heads, but actually out of a delight and enjoyment and kind of a little bit of excitement. How beautiful would it be to live this way? How enticing is it to follow the character of Jesus and ask the question, I'm going to look at my own budget and consider where can I create margin to be generous. I'm going to look to my own budget and ask the questions, what are the needs of the people around me and how can I incorporate that into my budget? I'm going to make plans about how I organize my time so that at the end of the day, I actually have energy and time to give life to my kids who need my energy and my time, instead of hoarding it and coveting my time and energy and seeing people as obstacles between me and soul care and self-help, or whatever you call that. What's the thing for you? What's the thing that you obsess over and covet, the thing that you long for that other people have, that you would tend to be overly protective over, or you pine after? I don't know what that thing is, but whatever it is, it's certainly not as great as what Jesus had when he was in heaven with the glories of God. And if he let go of that to give life to the people around us, then we can let go of that other thing and figure out how to use that to give life to the people around us. 10th commandment, you shall not covet. Let's pray.